and g'day. Today's recording is all about WonderWebby, or in fact WonderWebby's, who is Jasmine Traeger's, WonderWebby's project that she's got on at the moment called Beyond. Now Beyond is helping to microfinance a project in the Philippines, and it's all about, the project itself is all about going beyond what we would normally do. People who have gone beyond the normal to achieve something. The Noonday Demon by Andrew Solomon, An Anatomy of Depression. And I want to read you a passage from this. Andrew was in Cambodia for a while, talking to some of the victims of the Khmer Rouge. 5 days before I left the country, he says, I met with Faili Nuon, a sometime candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize, who set up an orphanage and a centre for depressed women in Phnom Penh. She's achieved astonishing success in resuscitating women whose mental afflictions are such that other doctors have left them for dead. Indeed, her success has been so enormous that her orphanage is almost entirely staffed by the women she has helped, who have formed a community of generosity around her. If you save the women, it's been said, they will in turn save the children, and so, by tracing a chain of influence, one can save the country. We met in a small room in an old office building near the centre of Phnom Penh. She sat on a chair on one side, and I sat on a small sofa opposite. Her asymmetrical eyes seemed to see through you at once, and nonetheless to welcome you in. Like most Cambodians, she's relatively diminutive by Western standards. Her hair, streaked grey, was pulled back from her face, and it gave it a certain hardness of emphasis. She can be aggressive in making a point, but she's also shy, smiling and looking down whenever she's not speaking. We started with her own story. In the early 70s, Faili Nuon worked for the Cambodian Department of the Treasury and Chamber of Commerce as a typist and shorthand secretary. In 1975, when Phnom Penh fell to Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, she was taken from her house with her husband and her children. Her husband was sent off to a location unknown to her, and she had no idea whether he was executed or remained alive. She was put to work in the countryside as a field labourer with her 12-year-old daughter, her 3-year-old son, and her newborn baby. The conditions were terrible and food was scarce, but she worked beside her fellows, never telling them anything and never smiling, as none of us ever smiled, she said, because we knew that at any moment we could be put to death. After a few months, she and her family were packed off to another location. During the transfer, a group of soldiers tied her to a tree and made her watch while her daughter was gang raped and then murdered. A few days later, it was Faili's turn. She was brought with some fellow labourers to a field outside town. Then they tied her hands behind her back and roped her legs together. After forcing her to her knees, they tied her to a rod of bamboo, and they made her lean forward over a mucky field, so that her legs had to be tensed or she would lose her balance. The idea was that when she finally dropped of exhaustion, she would fall forward into the mud and, unable to move, would drown in it. Her 3-year-old son bellowed and cried beside her. The infant was tied to her so that he would drown in the mud when she fell. Faili Nuon would be the murderer of her own baby. Faili Nuon told a lie. She said that she had, before the war, worked for one of the high-level members of the Khmer Rouge, that she had been his lover, and that he would be angry if she were killed. Few people escaped the killing fields, but a captain who perhaps believed Faili Nuon's story eventually said that he couldn't bear the sound of her children screaming and that bullets were too expensive to waste on killing her quickly. And he untied Faili and told her to run. Her baby in one arm and the 3-year-old in the other, she bolted deep into the jungle of northeastern Cambodia. She stayed in the jungle for 3 years, 4 months and 18 days. She never slept twice in the same place. As she wandered, she picked leaves and dug roots to feed herself and her family, but food was hard to find, and other, stronger foragers had often stripped the land bare. Severely malnourished, she began to waste away. Her breast milk soon ran dry, and the baby she could not feed died in her arms. Her breast milk... She and her remaining child just barely held on to life and managed to get through the period of the war. By the time Farley Newon told me this, we had both moved onto the floor, and she was weeping and rocking back and forth on the balls of her feet, while I sat with my knees under my chin and a hand on her shoulder, in as much of an embrace as her trance-like state during her narrative would allow. She went on in a half-whisper. After the war was over, she found her husband. He'd been severely beaten around the head and neck, resulting in significant mental deficit. She and her husband and her son were all placed in a border camp near Thailand, where thousands of people lived in temporary tented structures. They were physically and sexually abused by some of the workers at the camp, and helped by others. Farley Newon was one of the only educated people there, and, knowing languages, she could talk to the aid workers. She became an important part of the life of the camp, and she and her family were given a wooden hut that passed for comparative luxury. I helped with certain aid tasks at that time, she recalls. All the time while I was around, I saw women who were in very bad shape, many of them seemingly paralysed, not moving, not talking, not feeding or caring for their own children. I saw that they had survived the war, but were now going to die from their depression, their utterly incapacitating post-traumatic stress. Farley Newon made a special request to the aid workers and set up her hut in the camp as a sort of psychotherapy centre. She used traditional Khmer medicine, made with various proportions of more than 100 herbs and leaves, as a first step. If that didn't work or did not work sufficiently well, she would use Western medicine if it was available, as it sometimes was. I would hide away stashes of whatever antidepressants the aid workers could bring in, she said, and try to have enough for the worst cases. She would take her patients to meditate, keeping in her house a Buddhist shrine with flowers in front of it. She would seduce the women into openness. First, she would take about 3 hours to get to know each woman and let them tell her story. Then she would make regular follow-up visits to try and get more of the story, until she finally got the full truth of the depressed women. I had to know the stories these women had to tell, she explained, because I wanted to understand very specifically what each one had to vanquish. Once this initiation was concluded, she would move on to a formulaic system. I take it in 3 steps, she said. First, I teach them to forget. We have exercises we do each day, so that each day they can forget a little more of the things that they will never forget entirely. During this time, I try to distract them with music, or with embroidery or weaving, with concerts, with an occasional hour of television, with whatever seems to work, whatever they tell me they like. Depression is under the skin. All the surface of the body has the depression just below it, and we can't take it out, but we can try to forget the depression even though it's right there. When their minds are cleared of what they've forgotten, when they have learned forgetfulness well, I teach them to work, whatever kind of work they want to do. I will find a way to teach it to them. Some of them train only to clean houses or to care for children. Others learn skills they can use with the orphans, and some begin towards a real profession. They must learn to do these things well and to have pride in them. And then, when they've mastered work, at last, I teach them to love. I build a sort of lean-to and made a steam bath, and now in Phnom Penh I have a similar one that I use, a little better built. I take them there so that they can become clean, and I teach them how to give one another manicures and pedicures, and how to take care of their fingernails, because doing that makes them feel beautiful, and they want so much to feel beautiful. It also puts them in contact with the bodies of other people, and makes them give up their bodies to the care of others. It rescues them from physical isolation, which is a usual affliction for them, and that leads to the breakdown of the emotional isolation. While they are together washing and putting on nail polish, they begin to talk together, and bit by bit they learn to trust one another. And by the end of it all, they have learned how to make friends, so that they will never have to be so lonely and so alone again. Their stories, which they've told to no one but me, they begin to tell those stories to one another.